As you remember from last week, John Locke argued that if a thief attacks you and demands that you give your money at the point of a knife in the state of nature, you have the right to kill that thief. And then Locke reasons, if you can kill that thief, you can pretty much do anything you want to that thief. And that becomes the Lockean justification for enslaving that thief. The thief did something wrong, and now the thief is receiving enslavement as punishment. Now Locke says, imagine that we can transfer this argument from the level of an individual to a level of society. Imagine that we've got the Locke village, and the sons of the Locke village, Papa Locke's sons, Tommy and Johnny Jr., are off riding their horses, and they're somewhat near the village next door. Let's call the village next door the Hobbses. The Hobbses are pretty aggressive, and Johnny and Tommy overhear the Hobbs village shouting and getting mobilized for war, shouting things like, let's go attack the Locks. Let's go get those Locks, those evil villagers next door. So we're still in the state of nature. We've got a village level organization on both sides, and neither side acknowledges a common government. Okay, so we used this example before to talk about how Papa Locke may assume command of the village and assume kind of executive-like powers in the state of nature without a proper government, without a proper army, soldiers in uniforms, without a constitution, and so forth. But now let's think about this example as a way of seeing how Locke claims this Locke village could justly conquer the Hobbs village. So first of all, the Hobbs village attacks the Locke village. They're the aggressor. They're the wrongdoers. Let's say the defeats the attacking band of Hobbs villagers. And then, at the point of the knife, decides to spare the lives of these unjust aggressors, these justly conquered people. Well, the same reasoning that Locke applied to the thief example now applies to this just conquest example. Locke says the Locke villagers, in defending their village against this aggression against their property, now has the right to do whatever they want to the Hobbs villagers who attacked. This is a very crucial caveat. The Hobbs villagers who attacked. And now, if they want, the Locke villagers can enslave these attacking unjust aggressors. In this case, Locke would say the Hobbs villagers, and he's thinking that they're men who are in a kind of invading army, these Hobbs villagers will have been justly conquered. So this is another case, Locke claims, where despotic power can be exercised justly. And this is another case where Locke is going to try to justify household slavery. Locke immediately imposes limits on who in this situation can be subject to despotic power. So Locke says, look, I'll grant you, in this situation, the Locke village has despotic power. They've got the right of conquest. They are in the right. Their conquest is just. The Hobbs village is in the wrong. Those men who were part of that invading army can be justly enslaved. However, the Locke villagers cannot enslave people who are only tangentially or not directly connected to those invading armies. The just conqueror cannot enslave the servants of the invading army men. Why? Because all those servants did is sign some labor contract with their employer. What has that got to do, except in the most indirect way, with the fact that these Hobbes villager men decided to take up arms and invade the Locke village. Very little. Very little. And Locke also says the wives of the men who have invaded the Locke village, they too are innocents. So Locke is assuming here that the women did not have a part in the war deliberations or did not have a part in the the war council that decided it's time to invade the Locke village. So let's just grant him that assumption. Obviously here, there's some ideas here about gender roles and who's responsible for making decisions in war. But he says, just conqueror cannot enslave wives of the justly conquered. And finally, the most innocent of all, Locke is going to say, are these kids. The kids of the invading army have just got nothing to do with it. Why? Because they, unlike the servants and the wives, they haven't even reached the age of consent. That's what it means by definition to be a kid in Locke's political theory. So if they haven't reached the age of consent, how could they have taken part in those debates about whether or not to go to war with the Lockes? So they're innocent. Leave them alone. Leave them alone. You can't assault them. You can't harm them. You can't punish them because they didn't do anything wrong. Okay. Now Locke is going to say, and he realizes this sounds a little strange, you can't even take the property of the justly conquered. You can't even take the property. What's the argument here? So we're on page 101, and once again, Locke is going to be analogizing the individual case to the collective case of just conquest. Locke says, it is brutal force the aggressor uses that gives his adversary a right to take away his life and destroy him if he pleases. Okay, so that's the justification. There's an aggressor and there's a victim. Victim has the right to do whatever he wants to the aggressor up to killing him. Okay, but it is damage sustained that alone gives him title to another good. So you remember in Locke, there's a difference between the right of punishment. Punishment is what justifies despotism, at least at the household level. And then there's reparations. Reparations says damage of goods that alone gives him title to another man's goods. For though I may kill a thief, once again, this thief thing is super important for Locke. Though I may kill a thief that sets on me in the highway, yet I may not take away his money and let him go. This would be robbery on my side. I would be the robber if I took the thief's money. Similarly, Locke says the Lockean village would be the aggressors if they tried to take the land of the justly conquered. The only thing that would justify reparations, Locke would say, is if the Hobbes villagers on their way to invading the Locke village went through the Locke's land, the Locke fields, and started burning and destroying crops. Okay, but that's a separate issue than this direct bodily assault on the Lockes themselves. Okay, so it's damage to property in the sense of possessions and lands that justifies reparations in the sense of getting possessions and land from the justly conquered. And this is why Locke claims that you should leave the property and the lands and the estates to the wives and the children and even the servants of the justly conquered. The just conqueror has got to obey the fundamental law of nature. It was the violation of the fundamental law of nature that allowed for the just conquest, aggression, and then punishment of the aggression. Reparations, if you're going to take them, Locke says, have got to be limited. They've got to be proportional to the damage that you sustain. And Locke goes on, if there is any question that your reparations will actually end up harming these innocents, the servants, wives, and the children of the justly conquered, then you should exercise charity. you should not take what is yours due in a strict sense by the law of nature. You should ask for less. You should take less. So let's say the Hobbes army burned 10 acres on the way into the village. Locke would say, actually, just ask for the produce of 5 acres for one season. And the argument here is, although you probably do more than that, you should prevent harm against innocents as much as possible. You should preserve the species as much as possible, because not only is that your duty as a good Christian, he would add that as a sidebar, but he would say the law of nature, which is good for everybody, no matter what your religious beliefs, is to preserve the species. Preserve the species. Okay. So what is Locke saying here about despotic power? He's saying in the vast majority of cases, nobody should be subject to despotic power. All individuals, except the aggressor in a state of war, somebody who initiates force without right, all individuals except that aggressor who needs to be punished are free from absolute arbitrary power. Absolute arbitrary power, once again, being the very definition of despotism. Just conquest can establish a private despotism. In other words, just conquest, Locke thinks, can establish household slavery, and legitimately. And if that private despotism has been established on the grounds Locke has laid out, the grounds of punishment, basically, that power of slavery is absolute. It's arbitrary, too. It's despotic power. That's what it is. However, Locke says, just conquest can never establish a legitimate government. The reason for this, Locke says, is very simple. Because legitimate government is exercised over people who have not forfeited their right to self-ownership, to people who have not forfeited their natural liberties and their natural equalities, to people who, in other words, have done nothing wrong, who have not broken the law of nature. In that case, a legitimate government can only be established on the basis of the consent of the governed. So let's come back to this Locke village enslaving a number of individuals from the Hobbes village. Locke says that this relationship of master and slavery this is what he says in chapter 4, is a continuation of the state of war. The state of war is never really over. Why? Because the master has not tried to get the consent of the enslaved person. The master is basically using brutal violence. Perhaps it's justified in this exceptional case, but they're using brutal violence to rule. Furthermore, the master within the household is totally arbitrary. It's totally arbitrary. It's whatever he wants, basically. That's what he expects the slaves to do. Okay, so it's despotic power. How could this situation end? Well, first of all, Locke would say it totally ends with the deaths of those individuals who were justly conquered. Because remember, there's no claim on the children. There's no hereditary condition of slavery, according to Locke. There's no such thing as, quote, master races and, quote, subject races. No such thing. So once those Hobbes men, the ones who were directly invading, die, it's over. Let's say, how does it end before those Hobbes men die? Well, they could sign an employment contract. So just imagine that, okay, a couple years pass, and now everybody's old, and these Hobbes men are no longer a threat, and these Hobbes men are basically, they're 60 and 70, and instead of a master-slave relationship, the Lockes and the Hobbes work out a deal where basically the Hobbeses will start working for money, and they'll do this much labor for this much money, or they'll do this much labor per annum per year and get this much of a salary. Well, in that case, they're no longer conquerors and conquered anymore. They're basically employers, employees, and they've just signed an employment contract. The reason that the Hobbes will follow the direction of the Locks afterwards is because they signed up for it, because they've got basically a labor contract. And then Locke would say, imagine if after signing a labor contract, they actually came together with, and they were pretty much members of the Locke community, and the Locke community, the village, was growing so big that they thought they needed a more formal government. In other words, they were making the transition from a state of nature, a village in the state of nature, to a government in a civil society. Now, if the Hobbes at this point the war is long behind them, they've already signed a labor contract, they're pretty much just members of the community, they too could participate in signing a social contract. Okay, and that would be basically the end of the just conquest situation. In that case, obviously, Locke would say despotism is no longer justified. Okay, let's talk about other situations where despotism is not justified. And this has to do with the rights of resistance and revolution in John Locke. I'm probably not going to get to this second part about the legacy of John Locke. I didn't get to the legacy of Socrates with my Plato lectures. And that's largely historical information and background stuff, which we can talk about in Q&A, but which is not strictly necessary for understanding these books. Okay, let's start with the rights of resistance and revolution. First part is resistance. What is your right of resistance according to Locke? Okay, so first of all, we've got the normative situation, the normal situation of government. This is what Locke is going to say. And it's a satisfactory state. Let's call it satisfactory state number one. What have you got going on here? You've got a civil society, which is defined by a relationship between government and people, between public officials and private subjects. What's going on in this arrangement? Well, the people have signed a social contract, which establishes a government. The job of the government is to secure property in the sense of life, liberties, possessions, and estates. The government promises to use political power, the legislative power, the executive power, the prerogative power, the federative power, all these powers we talked about last week, in order to secure property. And the social contract has this clause in it for the people too. Because if it's the job of the government to secure property, it's the job of the people to obey that government so long as it is a reliable guarantor of their private property. So that's the normative arrangement. And in this case, Locke would say, there is zero right to resistance. Because this, the government is never perfect in this regard, but zero right to resistance. It's like an extreme case. And everything the government passes by way of law has to be obeyed by the people. There's an obligation on the part of the subject to follow those laws. Okay, if the legislative power and the executive power and so forth are being correctly used. Now let's imagine an unsatisfactory situation. And this is the unsatisfactory situation of despotism being exercised over subjects who have done nothing wrong and who are completely innocent. In fact, the one who has done something wrong in this scenario is the government officials. Because what's going on in this diagram? The government officials have left the civil society. Okay, so instead of occupying the top part of that diagram where the government is, they've left the civil society. They're outside of the bounds of civil society. They aren't following the law anymore, or the so-called laws that are passing are just arbitrary decrees giving the government absolute power. Okay, because remember, arbitrary and absolute, that's the definition of despotic power. Okay, and instead of using their government power, it's not even political power anymore, because remember, political power has this one job. It's by definition, it secures property. It's despotic power. They're using this government power that has become despotic to violently dispossess the people of their lives. So instead of securing the bodies and the persons of the subjects. It's now taking away their lives arbitrarily, murdering them, disappearing them, and so forth. Okay. Instead of securing their liberties and saying, oh, well, here's what the civil liberties are, and here's what rights all subjects have, say the right not to be arbitrarily searched and have your property seized in your own home. Now the government is doing the exact opposite. They're just invading those homes, searching those homes. You're all spies and so forth for a foreign power, blah, 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 taking your liberties away. Okay, and instead of securing their possessions, securing possessions like, say, the papers in your drawers and your personal information and correspondences, the government's just taking all that and throwing it into a bag. Instead of securing the estates or lands, the government is saying, this property is ours, we need it for purposes of national security, and we're just taking it away, and there's this terrible emergency situation, and that's what justifies our usage of all this prerogative power, these emergency powers. And by the way, the state of emergency is permanent, and by the way, you don't have any liberties and lives, possessions, and estates anymore. Now, if this sounds a little bit cartoonish, that's because we're going to the furthest opposite extreme, just to show you how this works. So if in one extreme, the government is perfectly doing its job, in the other extreme, the government is perfectly not doing its job. So violent dispossession in all these different ways. So it's the total opposite of the satisfactory state. It's the most unsatisfactory state you can get into, and Locke calls it despotism or tyranny. In this case, what do the people have? Well, Locke says they have a right to violently resist. Why? Because it's pretty easy. If you take a look at the contrast case, Locke's theory of obedience to the government is conditional. If the government is not meeting certain conditions, it loses all claim on obedience. So here is exactly where the government has lost claim to obedience, because it is not meeting the conditions on which it held government power, which it was supposed to have. It was supposed to use political power to secure property. No, instead, it's using despotic power to dispossess people of their property, and it's violent. And it's violent. Here's the other thing. So just take it back to this state of nature. If somebody in the state of nature initiates violence onto you, you have the right to violently resist. Force without right is coming from the despotic power. Force with right is coming as a kind of self-defense of society, the self-defense of the people themselves. And Locke thinks in this extreme case where the despot is just violently dispossessing huge amounts of people of their property in the expansive sense, it'll be clear to everyone. There's not going to be a lot of debate among the people. The people will very plainly see and feel and sense what is going on to them. In other words, that they're being treated like the absolute enslaved peoples of a despot. Okay, so they're being reduced to the condition of slavery. And another way of looking at this point is what the government has done, what the despotic power has done, is initiated a state of war back in the state of nature. And remember, the state of nature is any situation where two parties are interacting without a common government. And in this case, Locke is saying the despot and the people are absolutely in that condition. Why? Because there's no government. Despotic power isn't exercising political power. It's not a civil government. It's a despot using violent power, brutal force, and there's a state of war going on. So in this case, Locke would say the people can defend themselves up to the point of killing. Because remember, that's exactly what, if you could kill a thief for trying to take your purse, you can surely kill a despot from trying to, quote, enslave an entire population. Okay, and this became more or less the justification for regicide and other things that had happened in 17th century English history, periods that Locke lived through. Okay, how do we regicide is killing kings, basically. So the king is a tyrant. Okay. How do you get back to the normative situation? Locke would say it's actually pretty easy. The people in this scenario, for moving from a satisfactory state to an unsatisfactory state, back to a satisfactory state, the people never disbanded. The people never left their civil society. It's just that in their civil society, the position of government, as you can see in this diagram, is open. There was nobody there who was willing to hold that power on the condition of limiting their power to the securing of property of the subject. There was nobody there who would occupy the position of governors who would fulfill the terms of the social contract. The people were always willing to fulfill their terms, but they just didn't have the right people in the right government places. Okay, so that's the basic problem. So all you've got to do, according to Locke, is get some governors who are willing to actually abide by the fundamental agreement that makes up civil society, namely the social contract. And once you've done that, you're back, you're hunky-dory. You're back at a satisfactory state, but it's satisfactory state 2. It's satisfactory state anew, because now you've gotten rid of the tyrant and you've basically got legitimate public officers once again. Okay? And that part where you come to this satisfactory state again, that's what Locke calls revolution. So, stage 2 of this diagram, the unsatisfactory state, that's the right of violent resistance. Stage 3, where you come back to a satisfactory state, but a new one, is what Locke is going to call revolution. So, Locke's notion of revolution is, first you have to pass through a phase where you've had a despot that you have violently resisted, and then you come to the phase, revolution proper, where you re-establish political power, where the people entrust a different set of officers with political power. Because remember, for Locke, the subjects in a civil society do not exercise political power for themselves. The whole point is they have governors who exercise political power for them, on their behalf, for the common good. Okay, so this is kind of the from despotism to resistance to revolution story of John Locke. And this is the right Locke would claim that any people in any civil society have. They have the fundamental right to, let's call it, enforce the terms of the social contract. Locke knows that this theory in 17th century England is going to sound really controversial and really bizarre. And the reason is, as I just mentioned, there were civil wars. There were civil wars in England, and they lasted a long time, like a decade, if I'm remembering right. This happened in the middle of the 17th century. And there were all sorts of battles in England about are monarchs absolute? Are they appointed by God? If they're appointed by God, doesn't that mean you've basically got to bow down and put up with anything that they'll do? This is kind of Robert Filmer-like arguments. There were periods of dictatorship, military dictatorship. At a certain point, a guy, Oliver Cromwell, was running England as a military dictator. Okay, so there were, let's call it, fairly regular upheavals. And there were fairly regular contests, bloody contests, over how this country would be governed. Okay, and in the midst of all that scare, Locke realizes that some people are basically going to say, government, no matter how bad it is way better than the state of nature. government, no matter how, quote, abusive, in other words, no matter how much the people don't like what the government is doing, has to be obeyed almost unconditionally. And actually, some people were willing to say unconditionally. And if you're an absolutist like this, you believe in absolute monarchy, for example, king can do no wrong. There's still an unconditional requirement of the subject to obey. That if you're an absolutist of this sort, you are looking at John Locke like he is lost his rationality. Because what you're thinking is, Locke, you've just said that government power only imposes a conditional obedience upon the subject. You're saying government power is conditionally obeyed. And your fear is Locke has introduced a theory that will produce constant upheavals, constant civil war, constant rebellion, constant violence. Okay, and first of all, Locke says, he's defending himself now. He says, actually, no, it won't. Why would you think that? No theory is really capable of moving people into illegitimate rebellion. That's a very strange theory of human nature, where you think that instead of a bloody tyrant rousing people into upheaval, that you think a little pamphlet, the second treatise of government, is going to get people out in the streets when they have no business being out in the streets. So the first rejoinder is kind of a joke. Locke says, actually, no theory is capable of producing constant upheavals. And then Locke says, you know what actually gets people out into the streets and violently resisting government? It's tyranny. Actually, it's tyranny that does it. It's not actually my book. Locke says, this tyranny has to be generally exercised. Almost everybody in the society has got to suffer or have somebody close to them suffer under this tyranny. This cannot be just kind of minor and petty crimes of state. This has got to be widespread tyranny, which is just completely and obviously against the common good. And only in this case, where you've got a long train of abuses against the vast majority of your subjects, only then will you have people out in the streets willing to risk their lives in a violent confrontation with the government. They're not going to just risk their lives for some trivial, I don't like my tax rate. Locke thinks that's not how it's going to go. People are risk averse. Only this long trains of very serious abuses against the great majority is going to rouse the people into action. And then Locke is going to point to that situation and say, and you know what? The people are right. In that situation, the people are right. That what they're doing is they're exercising their natural right of resistance. The second thing is Locke is going to say against the absolutist is, you're calling us rebels, and you're claiming I, John Locke, am justifying rebellion. But that doesn't seem a very cogent or strict, and that doesn't seem like a very exacting argument. Because what is rebellion? Rebellion is you have an obligation, is what happens when somebody has an obligation to obey, but they don't fulfill the obligation. Instead, they use violent resistance. And Locke is saying, and he's doing a table turning exercise here, if the government is fundamentally reneging on its obligation to obey the laws, who's the real rebel? It's the despot here that's the real rebel. It's not the people. In fact, it's the people who are mad about the rebellion of the government. When the government no longer follows the civil laws, it is no longer meeting the terms of the social contract. It is breaking, it is violating one of the fundamental terms, which is, first of all, what the government is supposed to be doing, which is protecting property, using the law. And secondly, the idea that certain people are above the law and are not subject to the law and are somehow different than everybody else in the civil society, that is a delusion, Locke would say. That is one of the problems you left the state of nature and got yourself into a civil society for in the first place. This idea that some people don't have to follow the law, once again, Locke says, is one of the imperfections of human nature. And the fact that it has arisen in a civil society by people who don't want to live in a civil society anymore, who want to leave civil society and declare war on the people, that's rebellion. That is the very definition of rebellion. So it's the despotic government who's the actual rebel, not the people who are violently resisting a despotic government. So what Locke is really saying is theories of resistance and not theories of absolute government are the ones, if theories can do anything in this world, which Locke is not entirely sure about, but if theories can do anything in this world, the more dangerous ideas are those of the absolutists, not the ones like Locke who believe in things like social contracts. And the basic idea is, look, we know that there are imperfections in human nature. We know that people are not perfect. So let's come back to this Madison quote. Remember the Madison quote. If people were perfect, if people were angels, they wouldn't need government. And then we also talked about the other part of that James Madison quote. And the other part ran as follows. If angels were governors, we wouldn't need any limitations on government. Think about that. Because what Locke is saying, what Madison is saying following Locke, is the problem is we can't really perfect human nature. And so what we need are government institutions that will make up for our own imperfections. Because those yahoos over in the Capitol, those yahoos in government, are actually fundamentally no better than their subjects. That's the problem. Now, if that's the case, what do you got to do to make sure those yahoos stay in check, stay in line, follow the law, and so forth? Well, you need some kind of credible threat. You need some kind of, if you don't actually do your job, there may be the worst of all possible situations in this 17th century English imagination. That would be civil war. Okay, so notice one or two things here. Unlike Madison and the founders of the United States, their idea for keeping governors in check, Locke's idea for keeping governors in check was not just regular elections. That would seem like an obvious answer to a lot of contemporary United States Americans, okay? And probably in many other parts of the world where there are or have been regular elections, that would be, yeah, of course, we don't need violent rebellion and so forth. But that's not what Locke was saying. That was not what Locke was saying. First of all, because as I explained, he wasn't actually that big on elections. He did not want a universal franchise. He wanted property limitations and so forth. So he was looking for a way for the majority of people to actually participate, but only in a sort of emergency situation and only as a last resort. Locke also believed that this last resort of violent resistance and peaceful revolution, replacing a despotic government with a legitimate government, he believed that would be a credible threat and enough to keep the governors in check. On the other hand, if you're an absolutist and you're basically saying, yeah, the king can do whatever he wants, that's a recipe. You're just signing a blank check, and you're eventually going to pay for it. You're going to have to pay for that eventually, Locke is saying. Okay, another point of contrast is between Locke and Plato. Locke and Plato, because you see a huge difference in what Locke is saying, what Plato is saying. Plato's idea is actually, no, there is a group of people who are not fundamentally yahoos like us. There's actually a group of people who is qualitatively superior to everybody else. Plato and Socrates' claim is that group of people are going to be the guardians. And as you've noticed, there were no limits on what the guardians could do. All those passages where the guardians are saying, actually, what the poets are saying is lies, and we should keep that out of our school curriculum. Actually, here's when the mating festival should be, and here's the pairings that should happen during the mating festival. All these kinds of things that you see the governors, or let's call them the guardians in Plato's book, the guardians doing, that's not exactly what Locke would call limited power. Okay, because as you'll notice, Locke's idea is that the government regulates the external life of the commonwealth or the civil society. It doesn't craft the soul in the Platonic sense. Plato thought that the job of the guardians was to make everybody else better. In other words, to morally improve them. In other words, to bring out their spiritual qualities. In other words, to educate them morally. Locke has no such trust in the governors who run a civil society. He doesn't even talk about education one bit, as you'll notice in the second treatise, at least not as insofar as public education is concerned. What he says is there'll be private education, and of course, in the household, the parents have an obligation to educate the children. But it's a totally different kind of solution, because the Platonic solution requires that there is, in existence, this superior class of people. Locke says, no, there actually isn't, and this is why we need to keep government in check. Okay,